Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean back and forth 4 times. As you probably remember when we were at school, some of us, you learned a little ditty called "In 1492 he crossed the ocean blue," maybe even in kindergarten. We were taught to believe that Columbus was a hero, and he was. I'm not disputing that. He was the first explorer to visit what we now know as the Americas, the Caribbean. He opened the way to colonization. We might well have been living in Portugal and Spain. Not such a bad thing, but if he hadn't opened the way to the Americas. But nonetheless, despite his amazing achievements, and I'll cut to the chase here, he did not discover America, okay? Anybody has any doubt, I'm going to convince you over the next few minutes that he did not discover America. Which begs the question, how many of you get a day off or got a day off on Columbus Day? Yeah, well, you did when you worked. Well, quite a few, yes. You'll see why it is a complete historical misunderstanding, but it's fun to have a day off anyway, historical or not. Right, so as I said, he is also a very controversial figure, and he again illustrates what happens when we look back in time through the eyeglasses, the prism of our own current norms and behaviors. Anybody know what this is? A map. Oh, good. Okay. Yes, it is indeed a map. If I had a proper laser thing, the problem with the screens is that you can't they swallow up the laser. So anyway, this is the map of the 15th century as most people knew it. Asia, Europe in pink there, and Africa in ochre there. The thinking was, and this is an assumption that the church propagated, that if you went anywhere beyond, say, Spain on the west, or Castile in those days, or Asia on the east, or south of the equator, you would fall off. The Earth was flat. Well, this whole idea of the Earth being round was not a popular idea in those days. There were people who knew it, including Columbus, but most people didn't. And so imagine these people who are going out to explore beyond these boundaries. It must have been a very frightening idea. Okay. The prime motivators for this age of exploration that Columbus launched were historians like this alliteration, God, gold, and glory, but it pretty much sums it up. Economic factors, Spain and Portugal, which were the prime maritime powers in those days and seeking to expand, they wanted to find new trade routes. Everybody had been hearing about this guy, Marco Polo, who had gone out to the east, to the kingdom of Kublai Khan, and had found treasures and spices and silk and gold. And so the monarchs, both of Spain and Portugal, were very keen to get their hands on these treasures. Religious motivations, clearly the spread of Christianity and the religious competition mainly against Islam, which was very prominent in the eastern parts of the known world at the time. Political rivalry, Spain and Portugal, if you look at the map today, they're very small countries, relatively speaking, and they're next-door neighbors. In those days, they were both in real competition. We'll talk about that a little later on. And technological advances that enabled these explorations, mainly the magnetic compass, which had been invented or discovered in China 200 years before, or in the 12th century, I think, and had made its way to Europe. They had, of course, the compass was very important in terms of direction, so that they would know where they were going. There were maps, but the maps, most of them were from the ancient Greeks, so they weren't very accurate. And in terms of timekeeping, again, the sand glass and hourglass helped, but obviously it wasn't GPS or anything of the sort. Okay, so we've got a problem. Problem is that these routes, Here, okay. These routes here in green, or blue, or whatever, turquoise, they were the ancient Silk Road, the ancient spice road. It was a network of roads that led from the east to Europe, and it was shrouded in mystery. The traders, the mostly Muslim traders who had brought spices and other commodities to Europe over the years, refused to reveal where it was. So all that Spain and Portugal knew is that it was somewhere out there in the east. Now, over the years, this arrangement had worked okay. The traders came in from the east, met European counterparts, and traded. In the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire, which is the precursor of today's Turkey, conquered that whole part of the Mediterranean and what we know today as the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and that part. And they made it very difficult for the European traders to meet up with their Muslim counterparts. They set up taxing posts, and there were clashes. And the Portuguese, who were very far advanced in terms of their maritime skills in those days, they started exploring the option of going around Africa to get to India, rather than using that route through the direct route through the Mediterranean and the Middle East. I am told that I say too much I apologize, I'm trying to get over it. Right, so Columbus decided that he had another idea. He didn't want to go around Africa. And remember, again, there's competition and rivalry. And he proposed another idea. We'll get to that in a minute. Just Christopher Columbus, as you all know, Cristobal Colon in Spanish, born in Genoa, today in Italy. At the time, it was an independent city-state, self-taught. This is a photo of the house where he is thought to have grown up. It was destroyed in the 17th century in some war. It's a museum today. It closes at 5, so you won't make it. But if you ever want to go on a cruise and go there, it's there. So we don't know very much about him. We do know that he was incredibly curious. And here is what happens. He pitches this idea of going west to find the Indian Ocean. He approaches the king. First, he approaches the King of Portugal. The King of Portugal is very skeptical. He says, listen, first of all, I think you're underestimating the distance to the east. Secondly, we've already started exploring this idea of going around Africa, which seems to work pretty well. And he didn't want to buy into the scheme. Columbus sent his brother, Bartholomew, to England to see if the English court might be interested. Poor Bartholomew was captured by pirates on the way and made it back too late. And eventually, Columbus went to the kings of Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were very, very powerful Catholic monarchs at the time, and they decided to go for it. They were skeptical, but they really needed money. Why did they need money? Because they had waged a very long war known as the Reconquista to expel the Moors, the Muslims of North Africa, from the Iberian Peninsula, and their coffers were empty, and they also needed money because they had a very lavish lifestyle. So all in all, they just agreed basically to let him try. This is a photo of Columbus's own copy of the Tales of Marco Polo. As you can see, in the margins, there are his own annotations in Latin. And Queen Isabella was very enamored of this whole description of the East. And Columbus promised her that if he managed to find the East and he got there, he would set up trading posts for her to trade with. And this was obviously very appealing to her. This, by the way, was written at least 200 or 300 years before Columbus set out. Okay, now he Isabella and Ferdinand weren't the only ones who were interested in money. He wasn't an altruist, Columbus. None of the explorers were, by the way. Kind of disappointing to discover. Anyway, and they also wanted to give him an incentive to find the East. So they promised him, the title of admiral and the title of governor and revenue share, 1/10 of all revenues from new lands in perpetuity. Pretty sweet retirement plan. Right. So they set off with this, about these ships, the Santa Maria and the Pinta and the Nina, and they sailed from Portugal to the Canary Islands. From the Canary Islands, they turn west to cross the Atlantic. Now, how did they cross the Atlantic? They relied on what are known as trade winds. Trade winds are winds that blow along the equator from east to west. And when you don't have engines, which they didn't, they're very, very useful in terms of getting you where you want to go. So they sailed down towards the equator to ride these trade winds. And the old sailor's saying was that, how do you know when you've reached the equator? When your butter starts to melt. So their butter must have started to melt, and they turned west. My much better half, who's here with us today, did this a few years ago on a sailboat. He crossed the Atlantic from the Canaries to the Caribbean. The butter didn't melt, but he can tell you all about the trade winds and how that works. Right. So they go, this is the map. They go from Portugal, they're on top, the Canary Islands, and the first place they make landfall is the Bahamas. An island was called by the natives Guanahana, and he renamed it San Salvador. Then he sailed to Cuba. Can you all see? It's clear enough, right? Then he sailed to Cuba, which he called Juana. And then he went off to Hispaniola. Hispaniola is where today's Dominican Republic and Haiti. Now, when he reached Cuba, he was convinced that he had reached India. How do we know this? He says it himself. Let's look at this letter. On the 33rd day, I came into the Indian Sea, where I discovered many islands inhabited by numerous people. I proceeded along its coast towards the west for some distance. I found it so large and without perceptible end that I believed it to be not an island, but the continental country of Cathay. Cathay was the name used in the Middle Ages and beyond in Europe about China. Hence the name Cathay Pacific, if you know the airline. So now, he was convinced at that point. Whether he remained convinced throughout his life and his 4 voyages is a question that is very hard to answer. I surmise that he must have realized something was off, because obviously he didn't find what he was looking for, this famed passage, and he kept asking the monarchs to fund him again and again so that he could find it. So clearly he knew he hadn't reached India or the main part of India. Maybe he thought he just reached near India. It's very unclear what he thought, between himself and himself, but nonetheless, okay. So there are some theories that say that he deliberately underestimated the size of the distance to Asia in order to convince the Spanish monarchs, but either way, they, as I said, funded him, and he went, and he got to the islands, and as you all know, he believed he'd reached India, and so he called the native people Indios, and the Caribbean islands he called the West Indies, and those are the names that stuck. There are, I spoke about that, the differing accounts of whether he believed it or not, and he then meets the indigenous people. So he encounters people known as the Taino. The Taino are a subgroup of another group called the Arawaks, and they lived in what is now Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. And they had a very complex, like many of the indigenous inhabitants of the New World, they had a very complex hierarchical system, political system. They were farmers, they were musicians, they were craftsmen, but Columbus didn't know, and what he saw was that they would make perfect servants. Why? Because in a journal entry he says, I saw some who had marks of wounds on their bodies, and I made signs to them, asking them what they were. And they showed me how people had come over from another island nearby and tried to take them or to kidnap them, and how they defended themselves. They should be good and intelligent servants, and I believe they would become Christians very easily, for it seemed they had no religion. They did have a religion, it just wasn't his own, but he didn't know that. Now, this slide here, I called it Henry Higgins Behind You, because Columbus, he might have been the first to initiate this practice, but certainly he wasn't the last. The idea being that he would take some of the indigenous people, take them to Europe, convert them to Christianity, civilize them, learn how to dress and how to talk and how to behave, and either then use them as guides and interpreters or send them back to where they came from to spread the things they had learned. Robert Fitzroy, who was Darwin's captain on the Beagle, for example, those of you who've been to Patagonia, we were there on a cruise not long ago, and it turns out that Fitzroy took 4 people with him, 4 indigenous people, back to England. 3 of them died of disease, because they were not, they had no immunity to the diseases of Europe. And one of them, a guy named Jemmy Button, he did not die, and he made it back. They sent him back to Patagonia, and when the missionaries caught up with him 20, 30 years later, he was back to walking around naked, and he had forgotten pretty much every civilized behavior he'd been taught. This, by the way, this statue here, it's called The Discovery of America, and it shows Columbus standing next to a cowering indigenous girl, and it, believe it or not, stood in front of the US Capitol in Washington for many years until 1958, when somebody realized that it was perhaps in poor taste. Right. So, as I told you initially, all these explorers were not looking for a new world, they were looking for gold. There was no gold in Europe, or if there was, it was very minute quantities. And he gets to Hispaniola, and he sees the natives walking around with gold jewelry. To them, by the way, to the natives, it didn't seem like a very big deal. They just liked that it was shiny. They didn't realize that it had a value beyond that. In any case, he describes finding all this gold. You'll see in a minute his letter, and he catches a few of these Indians, and he says, please take me to your gold. No, he doesn't say please, I'm sure, but anyway. Okay, and the gold in Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic and Haiti, there was gold. It was mostly alluvial gold in the riverbeds, and there were some gold mines. They were very quickly exhausted because of this Spanish hunger for the gold, and this is what led the conquistadors in Spain to seek gold in other parts of Central America, Mexico, and then South America. Okay, so he is a man of some exaggeration. Perhaps he needed to exaggerate in order to keep the monarchs on his side. And anyway, he writes about what he found. Hispaniola is a miracle, mountains and hills, plains and pastures, both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. So again, there was gold, but this makes it sound like there was a lot more than there actually was. Right. So he returns to Spain about 8 months after he leaves, and he's received by the king and queen, and he brings them some of these servants, perfect servants that he caught, that he captured in the Caribbean, and he brings back a few bits of jewelry and some parrots, I think, or some colored, colorful animals. And he says, look, I didn't find the passage to India, and I didn't find a lot of gold, but I think this is very promising as a start. And he asks for funding to send him back to look for more. So indeed, he has granted his wish, and he sails back pretty quickly to the Caribbean. With this time, he's taking 17 ships, not the first 3, and 1,000, maybe 1,500 people, men, mostly men, with him. And these are, he takes along, craftsmen and people who would be necessary to build a settlement. So he's got priests and carpenters and stonemasons and metal workers and farmers, and this is going to be the core of his settlement in this new land that he discovered. His brothers, by the way, were also, Diego and Bartholomew were also on the way. Anyway, he leaves them in Hispaniola, and he goes off to discover other islands, and he kind of island hops. In some places he makes landfall, in others he just plants a Spanish flag on the sand or on the ground, and he claims the land for Spain. And in other places, he just looked, from afar and didn't make landfall. But in any case, these are the islands that he named. He gave them different names, but that's the idea. And then he goes back to Hispaniola. Now, because, as I told you, the kings had told him that he would be the governor and the overlord of this system, he set up what is known as a tribute system. A tribute system is essentially a system whereby the conqueror forces the conquered to give him money or goods. And he describes it, he says, in the Cibao it's a Dominican Republic, where the gold mines were, every person of 14 and up was to pay a large hawk's bell of gold dust. A hawk's bell is some kind of vessel that they had to fill up with gold dust. They were given, anybody who brought this gold dust was then given a token, and those caught without the token were in deep trouble, let's put it that way. So when he gets back to Hispaniola, he finds that the indigenous people, the Taino, are up in arms. They're furious. The settlers that he had left behind, those 1,000 or 1,500 men, had been abusing them and had been abusing their resources, and they were sick and tired of this, and they were getting ready to kick them out, essentially. Columbus allied with a local chieftain, and somehow, even though he was greatly outnumbered, but he managed to subdue this rebellion. Right, now, this was really the start of what we've known all over the years about the clash between the European colonizers and the indigenous people of the America. This figure here, I grant you, there is no knowing whether it was accurate or not. In 1492, there were an estimated 250,000. By 1517, so just 25, 26 years over, only 14,000 remained. Again, hard to know, it's a guesstimate, estimate, or what it is, but it does give you some sort of scale of the extinction or near extinction, as we'll see in a minute. They apparently were not extinct. Some died of, or many died of disease, or of slavery, or of starvation, and abuses. But it turns out that modern DNA has found that many people living in Puerto Rico, about 60%, and many people living in Jamaica and in the Dominican Republic actually have Taino mitochondrial DNA. They're ones from the mother's side. And probably what happened is that people who came over, slaves who were brought over from Africa, or Europeans who came to colonize Hispaniola and the other islands, basically intermarried and assimilated with whoever was left of the local population. And a guest came up to me on another cruise that I spoke on, and he told me, he was from Puerto Rico, he told me he was 1/4 Taino. He'd had it tested, and he was very proud. Right, so the indigenous people weren't the only ones suffering. The Spanish settlers also had a bad time of it. One indigenous man, well, he didn't wrote, he probably told somebody who wrote it. I'm assuming that when he was telling the story, it was no little amount of glee on his part. So a great many died from this plague, and many others died of hunger. We're talking about probably smallpox. They could not get up to search for food, and everyone else was too sick to care for them, so they starved them to death in their beds. Right. So in 1496, he sails back to Spain. He leaves. He convinces the monarchs, give me one more time. I'm sure I can discover this elusive passage to the east. And he's been there for 3 years already on his second voyage. And they grant his wish. And he leaves again, this time with 6 ships. He leaves 3 ships on Hispaniola, where the settlement is already expanding. And he takes 3 more. He goes to look for the passage. So finally, a landmass. He arrives at what's probably the tip of northern-day Venezuela at the Orinoco River, which is a very mighty river. And he recognizes from the topography, what he says is, there's so much water flowing in this river, it can't just be an island, it has to be a continent. It's just the water quantity is too large. And he writes, I believe this is a very large continent, which until now has remained unknown. And he calls it an otro mundo, another world. And he writes of finding an earthly paradise. You can imagine, coming from Europe, he sees all this exotic fauna and flora and parrots and fruit, tropical fruit, and he is enamored of the place. But his earthly paradise does not last long. He is already in his 50s, he's already 50, which in those days was ancient. Poor health, eye inflammation, arthritis. He returns to Hispaniola, and he finds a rebellion by the Spanish settlers. They claim, so it's not only the indigenous people who are rebelling against him, but the settlers say, you promised us all this gold and riches and you haven't delivered, and you're a very bad manager and you're a very bad dude in general. And some of them went back to the court in Spain and complained about him, and Columbus, hoping to quell this mutiny, had some of them hanged for disobedience, but it didn't really help him because the king and queen decided to look into these allegations. They might have decided not to had he delivered on the goods he promised, but since he didn't, they decided to look at these allegations. They send various groups out, including a group of monks, and in documents found 20 years ago, I think, or revealed 20 years ago, these monks tell horrific tales of what they found when they reached Hispaniola. I'm not going to tell you all the horrible things, just one description. One man was caught stealing corn and had his nose and ears cut off, and then he was auctioned off as a slave. And there are far more horrific things, which this is a cruise and we're here to have fun, not to hear such horrible tales. Okay, so they remove him. The king and queen decide, this is enough. They remove him as governor, and they arrest him, and they put him in chains and send him back to Spain. And he obviously is very bitter, and he says, I've placed under their sovereignty in 7 years more land than there is in Africa and Europe, and more than 1,700 islands. At a time when I was entitled to expect rewards and retirement, I was arrested and sent home loaded with chains. To add insult to injury, he gets home and he finds out that Vasco da Gama, who was a Portuguese explorer, had made it to Goa in India, circling Africa, and had managed to find India through that supposedly longer and unfeasible route. And he is obviously very humiliated and angry. The king and queen by the way, he sues them. This is amazing. He sues them for loss of revenue and loss of his positions. And his descendants carried on this lawsuit for 300 years until a court in Spain ruled in their favor somewhere in the 19th century, I think. Anyway, the king and queen, remove the chains, and they sort of forgive him, and he tells them, please, please, one last time. And they say, oh, okay. So he sails off, final voyage. He has 147 men and orders from the king and queen, don't go to Hispaniola, look for the passage to India. So finally he landed in what can reasonably be said the Americas, in Panama. If he'd only waited for 400 years, he might have been able to sail the Panama Canal. But anyway, so he gets to Panama, and then he sails off to Jamaica because he's heard that there's gold in Jamaica. So he sails on, and in Jamaica, his last ship is stranded, and he's stuck. And he sends a message to the governor of Hispaniola, and he says, please come and get me, I'm stranded. And the governor of Hispaniola hates his guts and refuses. And some of his crew have abandoned him, and the rest are hungry, and the local residents refuse to give them food. And so he plays a trick on them. He says, God is very angry with you. He knows that a lunar eclipse is coming. And he says, God is going to turn the sky red and black to punish you. And that indeed happens with the eclipse. And then, they're spooked out of their minds, and they bring him food. And he eventually gets rescued and goes home. He arrives home, and 2 years later, he's dead. Okay. Now, remember I told you there were 4 crossings. He made 4 crossings of the ocean. He actually made 6, except 2 of them were posthumous. So what happened was he was interred initially in Spain. Then his family, his daughter-in-law, I think, said, he would have loved to be buried in Hispaniola, which he loved. So they took his remains and sent them to Hispaniola. In Hispaniola, the French at some point captured Hispaniola, and the Spanish were afraid that the French would dig up the remains, so they moved him to Cuba, and then from Cuba, at some point, they moved him back to Spain. So not exactly a rest in peace, but anyway, right. So this is not a quiz, by the way. So he remains a controversial figure. I think all these answers are correct. He was a great mariner. He was a visionary. He was very stubborn. He was a national hero. He was very determined. He was a failed administrator, as we can see with all these mutinies. He was an abusive overlord and a ruthless imperialist. Nonetheless, as I said initially, to give him credit, he did just about double the size of the known world in those days by reaching that part of the world. Right. He also is credited with launching what is known as the Columbian Exchange, disease, of course, which is nothing to write home about, but a transfer of crops and animals and flora and food. So, for instance, Old World wheat becomes an American food staple. Wonder Bread. American foods like corn, tomatoes, potatoes, they're introduced into the European diets. Let's look for a second at this very short video that sums up this whole story much better than I did.
So how did Christopher Columbus really find the Americas? In 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 ships. He wasn't trying to discover a new world, but chasing a shortcut to India, a faster route for gold, spices, and silk. He sailed west, certain he could reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. After 36 days at sea, he spotted land. But he hadn't reached India. He was in the Bahamas. Still, Columbus was convinced he'd made it to the Indies, but he never set foot in what we now call the United States. And yet, even without realizing it, that wrong turn would change everything. He returned to Spain with stories of a strange new world, bringing gold, people, and tales of riches. Soon, more ships followed, colonies were built, and interestingly, cities like Columbus, Ohio, Columbia, South Carolina, and even the District of Columbia still carry his name. A reminder of how deeply his legacy was woven into the identity of a land he never meant to find.
Right. So this, broadly speaking, I would call this the law of unintended consequences, because he never meant to find America, and yet he has a day. He's considered the man who discovered the Americas. So why is he considered the man who discovered the Americas? My personal theory has to do with two things. One is what I'd call branding. You know, King Isabella and King Ferdinand had invested a lot of money and time in his excursions, in his exploits, and they didn't want to be seen as having been, you know, taken for a ride. So they really, you know, chalked up his journeys. There was the, pardon me, just one sip. And there was this letter that he wrote that was translated. Whoa, I sound like a frog, I'm sorry. That was translated into, I still sound like a frog, never mind. Translated into, it was spread 3,000 copies. It was like a, you know, the modern equivalent of a bestseller. And so he was, you know, quite storied and quite famous. And the other reason, I think, has to do with lobbying. The lobbying took place later on. Italian immigrants who came to America in the late 19th century and 20th century were exposed to great discrimination. They were Catholic, most of the population was Protestant, and they wanted to basically show that this guy, Columbus, one of theirs, who was a Catholic and an Italian, was actually the person who had made it possible. You know, he basically wanted, the idea was to basically say to the Protestants, listen, you might be living here now, but our guy, the Catholic Italian, he's the one who made it possible. So that is essentially the theme of this lobbying. The lobbying went on for years, both at the local level and state level and federal level. And now I'm going to talk to you about a political football. Please, politics is a very sensitive issue. I am not getting into right, left, wrong, tall, short, Democrat, Republican. This is just to illustrate what I mean by a political football. It could be any politics. So Columbus Day is first celebrated on the 300th anniversary of the landing by immigrants, Italian immigrants in New York. Then there was a horrific case, which I'd never heard about before, but which I went to look up on. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but there were 11 Italian immigrants somewhere near New Orleans who were accused of killing the local sheriff. And they were acquitted. The judge acquitted them. And after they were acquitted, this mob, lynch mob essentially, broke into the jail and killed these Italians. So President Harrison, in an effort to placate the American immigrants, as well as Italy, because Italy lodged a diplomatic complaint about this, he decided that would be a one-time holiday called Columbus Day. After further lobbying, President Johnson decided on a permanent Columbus Day, starting in 1971, and it was going to be on the 12th of October or the second Monday in October. The Knights of Columbus, which were a very powerful Catholic organization, JFK, I think, was a member, they were instrumental in lobbying for this. Columbus Day observances, as you obviously know, have been reduced over the years, but, and this I find very interesting, not because he didn't set foot in the Americas, but because of the growing realization of the injustice done to the indigenous people. And so many states and counties and cities have adopted Indigenous People Day in addition to Columbus Day. Columbus Day is a federally mandated holiday. It's a congressional act. It can't be undone, but, well, it can be, but it won't be. But in any case, but they added this celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. Even places like Columbus, Ohio, by the way, they don't mark Columbus Day anymore. So President Biden comes along and he says, I'm going to officially proclaim an Indigenous Peoples' Day alongside the official Columbus Day, marking the celebration. Okay, and then comes this, his successor.
Columbus Day. We're back. Columbus Day, we're back, Italians. We love the Italians.
Okay, so this is, he's signing this annual proclamation, and he says, you know, we're back to Columbus Day, and the Italians, as I said, don't read anything into it other than politics. Right, so I want to thank you. I want to thank Stephen and the technical staff, without whom I wouldn't be here. And just before you go, I'd like to tell you that I'm going to be speaking tomorrow about who really discovered the Americas. I think that's it too. Thank you.